Hello and welcome to this episode of Superhero Ethics. Friends, if you go back to the very beginning of this podcast, I think the first, if not some of the first episodes that Paul and I talked about were about Batman. He is the character who, I think for both of us, is one of our absolute favorites, if not our favorite, and certainly one we keep coming back to because I think when done right, his story raises so many of the issues and questions that this podcast is most interested in. Things like vigilantism and who gets to decide what is right or wrong and what to do about that, cops in a corrupt world, all of these kind of questions, wealth. And so when I found out that there was another addition to the Batman oeuvre, the recent show called Batman Caped Crusader, which interestingly enough is not coming out on Max, even though I'm pretty sure Max is owned by Warner Brothers, the DC connection there. It's on Prime. So there's a story there that I'm not sure about. If readers know about, please let us know. But once I saw that it had come out, I knew that I wanted us to watch it, and I knew I wanted Paul to watch it with me. And my first thought is I know Paul was very busy, doesn't always get to watch things. So when I checked in with him and he said he'd already watched all 10 episodes, I thought, okay, I've got my homework. Let's do this. So, Paul, let me just start by asking you, before we even go into this show, let's kind of do a check-in for people who haven't gone all the way into our back catalog. What are your feelings on Batman as a character?
I like Batman as a character. Batman is one of my favorite characters. One of the things I really enjoy is that there are many iterations of Batman, and some of them I like a lot more than others. But, I really physically turned this off and it turned itself back on. It's like a Batman villain. Which I guess we'll probably get to here, some of those instances. But the thing I think I've always liked about Batman is just that, Batman's a character who had tragedy early on in life, which, I had some of, and thus found that kind of relatable. And then basically decided, this is something I don't want to happen to other people, so I'm going to try and do something about it in whatever way I feel I can. And I think the fact that Batman does that in a way that's outside of the system, not super healthy system, is something I appreciate. Obviously, that may or may not work in reality, and in various Batman stories, it works better than others. But for me, it's mostly just the idea of having conviction in something and then just taking extraordinary action as a result of that conviction. And then also just wearing black all the time. That's the other half, really. Those two things.
Yeah, you and I both came up sort of, neither one of us were the fishnet black eyeliner type, but we certainly spent a lot of time on the outskirts of Gotham, metal community. I'll tell that whole thing again. Yeah, I often think about how much the 1989 Batman, Tim Burton, Michael Keaton, really shaped a lot of my identity and ideas of high school, and how much he became the superhero I cared about. Particularly because and it's interesting, I think you and I have very different approaches to Batman. All that you just said, I think is interesting and important and would be on my list of reasons why I like Batman so much, but probably near the bottom. Because for me, it's really about the idea of the ethical questions about it. Because I think it's a theme that we've come up with a lot, especially when Jessica Plummer's come on. She's very much a Superman fan, and we tease each other about are you a Batman person or a Superman person? I grew up with those Christopher Reeve movies, and they were fun, but as I got older, I didn't believe them. They're very much based on the idea of, could this person exist who is super, not just because of his power set, but because you can absolutely trust him not to abuse those powers. And that's, in many ways, I always felt that's more the fantasy than the idea that he has these powers to begin with. And I think what I loved about Batman is that from the first, they were always much more about the moral complexities about it, and even sometimes it's really about should he be doing this in terms of is it helping the city? Should he be more of a vigilante or less? The way that I think the who directed the Dark Knight and
Christopher Nolan.
Yeah. Sometimes I think it's about as in the Christopher Nolan movies, particularly The Dark Knight. Sometimes it's more about just for him personally in terms of like how he's working through trauma. And I think a recurring story is always like, is this actually helping him with his trauma? Is this a good way for it to deal? Or is it doing more harm to Bruce Wayne than it is good for the city? And how do you balance those things and stuff like that? And one thing I was thinking about a lot in terms of this is that, we hear so many debates about canon and about like what is real or not. And for example, with Star Wars, I know that you and I have talked a lot about how Luke Skywalker is treated. And like I really love the way Luke was treated in Last Jedi. You very much did not. That's totally legit. But part of the thing is we only have one version of Luke.
Right.
Batman is a character who I think part of what I love about him is that we now have so many versions told by so many people that we're kind of beyond a discussion of canonicity. Because every story, it may exist in partnership with a number of other particular stories, but it's one particular version. And I was thinking about this, especially in terms of a phrase that you and I used a lot, in particular regarding the Batman of the Snyderverse, the Ben Affleck Batman, which is not my Batman.
Right.
Which I think people sometimes hear that. I think sometimes people used it in the same manner of that very toxic, like, my version is the right one and all the others are bad, et cetera, et cetera. But actually, what I love about Not My Batman is to me, at least as I understood it, I think you would agree, but tell me if I'm wrong, it's a statement of saying, look, there is no one definitive Batman. There are lots of different Batmans out there. There are particular ones that I like and that feel right to my understanding of Batman. And so when I say Batfleck was not my Batman, I'm not saying someone else is wrong for liking it. I'm saying my opinion is that doesn't fit the Batman idea that I really care about and like. And to me, that makes it a lot more interesting to talk about Batman because we're not getting into the like who's right or who's wrong. I mean, I have my feelings on that, but it's not about, are you a real fan or not? It's just what part of Batman speaks to you. Did that sound right to you?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, I'm sure people use any given hashtag in a number of different ways, right? But for me, I had a visceral negative reaction first to the casting news of Ben Affleck and then to the actual character in the movie, Batman v Superman, or vice versa. What was it? Yeah, it was Batman versus Superman. Anyway, but then I kind of had a bit of a moment of, mostly I think because they kept coming out with animated films and I would go back and watch some of the others and I was just like, you know what? This is okay that there's a lot of different Batmans. And in fact, it's kind of cool, and if the only Batman we ever got was live action Batman and we were going to get one per decade or every 20 years, and then that was going to be the only one we had for like 10 or 20 years, I think I would have felt differently. Right? Like it would have bothered me more. Like it bothered me at first. Then I was like, this isn't really a big deal. It's like, yeah, that's not my Batman, and like when I then watched The Batman, the Matt Reeves movie, I was like, in the beginning, I was like, oh, this doesn't feel like my Batman. And then as the story went on, I was like, oh, they're kind of telling a story of how, Batman becomes Batman, right? How he goes from being a guy on a quest of vengeance to being a guy who's like trying to do something more, really, and how he's going about it differently. And also I left out, the idea of like being a detective, of really trying to seek the truth and then do something about it, as opposed to kind of assuming you already know the truth or just not even having the mental capacity or the whatever resources to ascertain like what's going on. And stories of intelligence are always interesting to me, but then especially like how someone uses their intelligence. And and that's really maybe the most important aspect of Batman, because like to me, like when I see Sherlock Holmes, I'm like, that's my Batman, kind of. Like it's the same archetype in many ways, not exactly the same, right? There's differences, of course, and Sherlock Holmes is often referenced in Batman stories. Sometimes that's like one of his mentors. Sometimes, like in the Cape Crusader, they refer to, oh, I've read those stories too. They mention them and they allude to them. And, that idea of a character who really wants to know what's going on and is curious about the world and has the mental acuity to kind of like really see what's going on and figure stuff out. And so I really enjoy that there's so many different Batmans. I mean, there's literally ones where Batman is a man bat. And I know there's a character called Man Bat, but like and actually I think that character's called Batman there's a lot of Batman stories. That's the point. And there's a great diversity of them. And I love that. And like here we also get different versions of Penguin. We get a different version of, Harleen Quinzel. We get a lot of characters who are different than they were in something else. And that's cool because we know we're going to get another version again soon. And so if we don't love this version, like there'll be another version. And it's not like this is the one true story. It's like, no, this is a story. Enjoy it. Don't enjoy it. Take it for what it is. Get what you get out of it. And I appreciate that about, Batman storytelling in general.
Yeah, there's a real what if element to it. And I want to say from the beginning, I think there's probably a lot more characters who in comic books, just if you've been writing a comic book about someone for 50, 60, 70 years, you're going to have so much diversity and so many different writers and so many different ideas. The thing is that, and there are lots of great people who really focus on comics. Our friends at Hype is My Superpower podcast, they focus on Marvel comics, but I highly recommend them. Both Paul and I are people who really love comic book characters, but aren't really big comic book readers. I think, Paul, you've read more than I have, but I think you agree that like our main interaction with characters like Batman is on screen.
Yes, that's accurate.
Yeah, and so I think that for whatever reason, Batman is one of the few who has gotten so many iterations on screen, particularly with animation, but also just like, if you're a Gen Xer or even an older millennial, think about how many different actors have played a live-action Batman in your lifetime. In my lifetime, we've had Keaton, Clooney, Val Kilmer, Ben Affleck, Robert Pattinson, if you want to stretch it a bit, the guy who played the voice of Lego Batman, Will Arnett. Yeah, Will Arnett, thank you, etc.
Well, in terms of live action, also there's one of the shows, right, has...
Oh, yeah, like Gotham has young Bruce Wayne.
Yeah.
And then the show Titans, which is kind of the Teen Titans TV show, but live action, has the guy who plays Guillermo Mormont, as an older Batman. Yeah, so there's just so many different versions. And so with that, I think one other thing I want to also touch on, just because you brought this up with the detective part that's so big, I think the thing that helps for me make Batman raises so many interesting ethical questions, and I think this very much goes in with the detective because he always wants to learn more. Batman probably cares more about the motives of his rogues gallery than most others. I think Spider-Man is maybe the closest equivalent.
For sure.
And because of that, Batman often has a lot of sympathy for a lot of the people in his rogues gallery. And it goes a lot beyond like Batman good, villain bad. In that Batman is, for the most part, with some exceptions, actively breaking the law. And there's a lot of ways in which you could look at, like, it raises other questions of like, is a vigilante a good thing or a bad thing? His villains are doing actual harm to people, but often have somewhat understandable motives. Iceman being one. Dr. Freeze, Mr. Freeze. I'm bad with names. We all know
Mr. Freeze. He's also Dr. Freeze, though, right? Because he's a doctor and his last name is Freeze, Victor Freeze.
Yes, I think it's true.
But his name is he goes by Mr. Freeze.
Yes. Yeah. Who is not defined by the bad puns as the Arnold Schwarzenegger version of him would lead you to think. But again, but yeah, so I think that's the other really important part of him, is that there's a lot more about who the Rogue Squad are and how they became villains. And most of them are very over the top. Some of them are very malicious and evil. Some of them, and I think we saw a good example in this show, we'll talk about in a second, really don't understand that they're doing harm. And Batman often has a lot of sympathy for them. And like, I love that you talked about vengeance. I think in many ways, Batman is one of the best stories we have about how to shift from wanting to do vengeance to wanting to work for justice or wanting to, prevent harm to others. and how there's a danger of falling into vengeance instead, and all those questions.
Yeah, for sure.
So with that, let's start talking about this show. And I don't think you're going to have watched the show in order to enjoy the conversation, but we will be spoiling a lot of things in it. So I highly recommend, if you can, you haven't seen the show yet, hit pause, go watch it. It's 10 30-minute episodes, so it comes out to, about 5 hours or so of content. I think it's very good. I think I've got some problems with it that we'll talk about, but overall, quite an enjoyable part of the story. But with that, Paul, what really struck you about this version of Batman?
Well, to begin with, I felt like this Batman himself was similar to the Matt Reeves Batman, right? In The Batman, where he wasn't
notable. Matt Reeves is an executive producer of the show.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, and like when I saw his name in the credits, and that it like made it easier to make the connection. Okay, that's why he's calling him Pennyworth, not Alfred, and that's like kind of, I mean, spoilers, right? You just gave the spoiler warning. Like by the end, he calls him Alfred. Like that's his big character moment. That's like Batman's big character moment is like he stops calling Alfred Pennyworth. He calls him Alfred. He corrects himself. He's like, this is a person. I'm going to treat him like a person. That's important, not just like he's, a servant, right? And not just like he's a cog kind of in the Batman machine. So in terms of Batman, I feel like he was a very kind of consistent, very much my Batman who's not quite yet all the way my Batman. He talks about vengeance. He picks up a gun and fires it a number of times, but scares him, I guess, and then he gets apprehended. Not Batman. There's a whole thing about hunting down Batman, which like I can do without. I'm like, okay, I've seen enough iterations of that story, kind of, and it never makes a ton of sense to me. It's interesting that like
you're freezing on me.
I think that the most interesting parts of this.
Yes. You froze on me, so can you just start again with it's interesting that?
Yes. I don't remember what I said there though. But
the last thing I heard you say was that the whole thing about the cops chasing Batman is never the most interesting part of the story to you. Doesn't really make much sense.
Oh, yeah. It's interesting that the cops are just like shoot on sight and they're really into shooting at people in this story. I think Batman himself is probably not at all the most interesting part of this story. I feel like this Batman is very much just like, he's who he is. He's a Batman that I recognize as Batman. And I think actually the Gordons are two of the most interesting characters here. And, they talk a lot about, Barbara Gordon in this version is a public defender. And her father, Commissioner Gordon is a commissioner, right? And so he's already commissioner. He's in charge of the whole police department. But he's got pressure from the mayor's office. I had flashbacks to our Wire conversation. During, thinking about this whole thing. Barbara and her dad like have a lot of conversations about, what's the justice system doing? Is it doing good? Is it, is putting people behind bars in the way that they're doing it? Is this a good thing? Is this like what we should be doing kind of? And, I'll say that, the Matt Reeves, Gordon, who's not yet commissioner, but, in that version, he's black. Right. And it's not a big deal within the context of the movie. I think they actually do kind of say something about that, right? That's kind of, but maybe they do.
I think so. Yeah. I haven't seen the movie in a while, but I believe
so. But like, it's still, regardless of whether it's relevant within the context of the story or to what extent it is, I think it's obviously going to be relevant in terms of how the story feels living in our world, right?
Yeah.
And watching it from where we are. And so to see Barbara, who in this story is also black, have this conversation with her father, the two of them, I think that conversation about the justice system and what it's doing, is it doing good? Is it doing harm? I think that conversation feels different when it's between two black characters than when it's between two white characters, which is what we see, I think, a lot more often just because of, the demographics of television and movies, really.
Right.
But so I feel like, here Barbara has a lot more agency than she does in some other versions.
Mm-hmm.
She's an adult doing adult things. And, she's friends with Dr. Quinzel and with, I think, was she a Sergeant Montoya, Detective
Yep.
Montoya, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's a lot of really good stuff in all of those dynamics, and I enjoy her and Commissioner Gordon and kind of all of them getting to be a little bit more center stage characters. And like Batman's doing Batman things, and you still get to see Batman do cool things and be a detective and like do stuff, right? But like he, in some stories, I think he's kind of sucking up more of the oxygen than in others.
Mm-hmm.
And in this one, I feel like it reminds me almost a little bit at points of Batman Returns, right? Which we covered with Ashley, and how, Batman's there doing Batman things, but it's like there's a lot of other stuff going on. And after recently talking about Cobra Kai and how it felt like the show's writers were not very interested in their characters, and they're kind of just about creating this kind of drama, here I really do feel like the writers are very interested in their characters, the same way Batman's very interested in his rogues gallery, and like, what are their motivations? Why are they doing what they're doing, right? It's not, the antagonists are not antagonists for the purpose of having an antagonist. They are antagonists because they want something different, because there are people who want something different than what the protagonist wants, basically.
For sure.
And I think that just makes better stories.
Yeah, it really does. And a couple of times we actually get the point of view of an antagonist. In one case I'm definitely going to talk about in a bit. But I wanted to focus especially on the Gordons, as you said, because one of the dynamics that we've seen a number of times is the idea of kind of what is the role of the public defender, of the defense attorney, and the frustration that cops and prosecutors often have with that person. And is that person incredibly corrupt? And are they part of the police? Are they part of the problem? Or as I think is the much more accurate portrayal, should they be understood as part of the justice system, in that their job is specifically not to try and allow criminals to go free. It's to make sure that the justice system is as non-corrupt as possible, that they aren't cutting corners, that they are doing everything the way that they should be doing. And we can talk a lot about whether that's a system that is, like, whether it's a Band-Aid or a real monitor system or all that kind of things. But like, take, for example, in the TV show Arrow, you have this exact same dynamic in the Lance family, where the father is a police captain. I think he eventually becomes police commissioner. He kind of rises up through the ranks. And his daughter is a defense attorney. And he gets mad at her for defending. And they have like the very surface level of this conversation, but it never really goes deeper. And I feel like here it does go a lot deeper, especially, as you said, by giving Barbara friendships with a psychiatrist who is also another person who, she's the person who decides if a person is like, a criminal or mentally, she's the person who decides like whether or not a person is like mentally fit in order to like stand trial, or should be understood as sick and not evil. And it's a whole other system we can spend many episodes about. And of course, her character goes in some interesting directions. But the conversations that they have help to, again, ground it. I very much agree with you that making them both Black in a system that where often it is people of color, and especially Black people, who are the victims of prosecutorial misconduct, police misconduct, and often are not able to afford the fanciest defense attorneys, and they'll get the public defenders who, I want to be clear, are doing the Lord's work. I mean, public defenders are some of the most underappreciated people in this country, I think, but often they don't have the resources to do a very good job, and so often don't get a good defense. And so, yeah, I really appreciated the way that those conversations, because I think, for me, one of the fundamental questions, I think, at the heart of Batman, that I think has always been there, but that Christopher Nolan, I think, really brought to the surface a bit, and is a question that like we're wrestling with a lot more today than we have been at other times in the past, at least more publicly. Can the system be saved? Right. And is the role of Batman that the justice system fundamentally works, but there are people who have slipped through the cracks, and so Batman is there to deal with that, is the idea that the system is corrupt and fixable, but you need a Batman to be dealing with the stuff that the police can't deal with right now so that the system can fix itself, which is kind of the Christopher Nolan version of two of the movies, but not, I mean, his vision gets very confused, I think. Or is it the idea that the system is utterly fundamentally broken and unsavable, and so you need a Batman and a lot of other bad people? And I don't think this show really tries to give an answer to that. It really, because part of the idea is that I think Nolan is, as you said, not Nolan, sorry, give me. Commissioner Gordon definitely is one of the good cops in an ACAB world, but he's trying to do the best he can. But
he wants to be a good cop. That's his.
Yeah. He's of the idea that like you can toss out the bad apples and save the whole bunch.
Right.
And he wants to find those bad apples, but he's dealing with not only all of this pressure from on top, but also a lot of his subordinates just are utterly uninterested in what he's trying to do and wind up kind of going around him, particularly Bullock and Bullock's partner.
Flass,
thank you.
Yeah.
And so I just think I like things that raise harder questions for us without giving a specific answer. And that's what I kind of think this was done. Like, I at least didn't think it was giving a specific answer of here's the way the criminal justice system should be. It was saying like, this is a broken system, and Gordon and Batman are kind of on two opposite ends, both trying to fix the system. Right. And here's where they're successful and here's where they're not.
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel like trying to give a clear answer one way or the other, certainly in a show like this, I think would be a mistake. Like, I mean, I guess you can have the viewpoint that the system is good and sometimes people are bad. And so you want to try and portray a picture of optimism. They're like, hey, look, we can make the system work. We just have to kind of root out the bad apples. Right. You can also have the opposite viewpoint that like the system is maybe even inherently bad, not just like the system's corrupt, right? It's bad and needs to be dismantled. And that's another viewpoint. But I think if you're trying to tell a Batman story, you could obviously have the first one. The second one, I think, is tougher. The second one feels more like you're going to have to tell a Punisher story or something. I don't know, if you want to go there. But I feel like a lot of the best questions, a lot of the toughest questions are best left unanswered in fiction. And I think it's generally better to present characters with different viewpoints, have events that challenge those characters' viewpoints, as happens with Barbara, right?
Yeah.
And happens with Jim as well, Jim Gordon. And Batman for that matter. And basically challenge your characters and just kind of show how someone might deal with sort of thinking one thing, then seeing something that kind of contradicts that to some extent or challenges that. And then kind of how do they square that and how do they proceed, and not saying, oh, this is the way things are, this is the way things should be, but kind of just like telling a story where people are people, and I think even just asking the question and just putting it out there I think it trusts the audience to an extent to say like, look, here's some stuff to think about and go ahead and think about that to the extent that you want, right? We're not going to like constantly belabor it. We're going to put it out there. And then, here's an explosion and here's some cool fight scene and, and then a couple character moments. And so it's not like the whole show is this stuff, right? But this is these themes are present. Yeah. They're thick within the show's broth.
I mean, in some ways, what you described is kind of the kind of story for which this podcast exists. Because I always thought that a lot of what we do here is when fiction raises questions. And if they offer, we discuss those questions. And if the show offers an answer, we might wrestle with that answer. Or in this case, we're much more open. We can talk about that. And one thing I kept thinking about, and especially with your comments just now brought up for me, is that I feel like the movie, The Batman, doesn't offer a solid answer, but offers more of a direction that an answer could go in that I don't think I saw here. And maybe you saw it and I just missed it, because and I think you actually helped me see this in the movie The Batman. They're more explicit than they are in this about part of what he wants is he wants to make criminals be afraid. And then in some of the last scenes of that movie, he winds up being the literal light that helps that other people can follow towards salvation, towards being saved from this drowning, And I think it's the idea of like, in some ways, it's I don't want to offer fear to the bad people. I want to offer hope to the good people.
Yeah.
And which I think is a very interesting kind of like, hey, what if this is a shift? And it's interesting to me that this Batman doesn't go there, but I kind of wonder, like to me, it seems like they're both part of the same kind of conversation, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think, I mean, that image of Batman holding this like flare in the darkness and leading all these people through the water, like out of, this submerged stadium or event venue or whatever, is like, that's to me, that's like the most enduring image of that film,
Yeah.
And like, maybe he's still inciting fear in people who want to do harm to the people who he's trying to inspire hope in. Right. And here, there's definitely not that like symbol of hope kind of thing going on. Right. So much. But there's, I think it's, I mean, it's a whole season. It's like you said, it's close to 5 hours. Honestly, like the actual runtime minus the credits is probably not that different from the Batman movie.
It's a very long movie.
But there's so many more characters here. Right. I mean, the Batman takes its time with a smaller number of characters. Here, we have a big cast.
And I do think, as I think about it, there are some elements of hope in this story as well.
Yeah.
Or particularly of Batman offering hope to the characters. Particularly, I think, for Jim Gordon. Because I think when Jim Gordon, like, there's this sort of feeling of, like, for both Jim and for Barbara and some others, they at first very much resist the idea of the Batman. Because to them, they're dedicated to the system. And someone working outside the system is by definition wrong and bad and just as much of a criminal.
Right.
And towards the end, I think both of them, like, I think especially for Jim, the Batman helps remind him that he's not alone.
Yeah.
That there are others who want to fight the fight that he's fighting, that even if most of the system is corrupt, there are people who want something to be better. And I think we see scenes of the people of Gotham having some sense of Batman gives me some hope that someone's on my side at a time when it seems like all the people are out to get me, including the cops.
Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah, for sure. And I think, the scene of, going into that burning building, and where Gordon confronts Batman for the first time, but then realizes like at that point, Batman just cares about like saving people from the fire,
Yeah.
Like that's what he's there for at this point. He tried to catch the fire bug, right? But like that didn't work out. And now he's just, he's just trying to save some kids and whatever. Yeah. And I think that's where Gordon like sees who Batman is, right? In terms of like what he's really trying to do. And then you actually get kind of like the flip of that where Barbara actually runs into a burning building or a destroyed building to save Batman,
Right.
And
then Batman's kind of a dick to her about it, but that's again,
but Batman's just kind of a Batman to her, It's like that's what he doesn't want other people risking themselves for him, right? Which I think maybe eventually he comes around on, but like not soon, not in most of the Batmans I see.
Well, because I think there's this idea of like I think in the Christopher Nolan movie, Batman does not want other people trying to be like assistant Batman,
right?
In part because he doesn't need them and they actually get in his way.
Yeah.
In this one, I think the implication is that he may well have saved himself. He's Batman, but he's unconscious in a burning building.
Yeah, it looks pretty bleak.
Yeah, I think there's a good possibility that if Gordon doesn't save him, he dies in that moment. And so it's not even just I don't want you to help me. He's unable to acknowledge that he needed her help. And I think that's very tied in to the Pennyworth Alfred thing, where this is also the start of him realizing he needs Alfred, both as like his man in the chair, but also as like his only human connection is Bruce Wayne.
Right, the only person who knows all of who he is, really.
Yes, exactly. I want to quickly comment on the Firefly and then use that as a way to start talking about some of the antagonists we get, because Firebug, forgive me, he's not a
Yes,
Firefly,
yes.
as he reminds us. He's only in one episode. We don't get much of him, but we got one moment that I thought was such a beautiful way of showing us his inner story, and that he is someone who is not malicious in the slightest, because he is portrayed as someone who just is, I don't know what technically the term pyromaniac means, because I know that there's a medical definition, and I don't know if this is at all accurate to that. But I think we are supposed to believe that he is someone who has an obsession and a love with fire, and simply does not understand the negative consequences of it.
Right.
And we see him getting ready to light a building on fire, and including lighting a number of children on fire. And we get a moment, like literally through his goggles, and what he sees is children playing in the street and having fun, and then children on fire having even more fun
Right.
while they're playing in the street. And like, it would be very hard, I think, to externally try to convey the idea that he doesn't understand that he is doing harm. But just with those like 3 seconds, I don't know, I think you feel the same, but tell me,
Yeah.
I was hit so hard with this idea of, oh, he is sick. He is not malicious in the slightest. And like, he's a danger, and we have to
Yes.
prevent that. But this
Very
is not a person who wants to do harm. This is a person whose brain is different enough and off kilter enough, I guess I could say, that he fundamentally does not understand that what he's doing is not good.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he clearly does not have a grasp on the reality of what
Mhm.
fire does to human bodies. He has a different view, and he thinks that's a good thing, not in a, oh good, I'm going to kill people, but like, look, they're on fire, isn't that great? Like you light a log on fire and then it's bursting in flame and it's so pretty, and like, why wouldn't they be happy this way? And so he's clearly not well in a very, very specific and very harmful way, but like, he's not evil. He's not trying to cause harm. It's like, if somebody's swinging their arms around wildly because they're excited, and maybe they have scissor hands or something, and they don't understand that their scissors are hitting people, right? It's like the same thing, kind of, where it's just like, it's a total disconnection from the consequences of his actions. And I mean, even thinking that there are these positive consequences that aren't what's
Right.
real. And he's just a guy who needs help, right? Like, I also am not going to speak to the accuracy of that from the standpoint of psychiatry, but as far as a character goes, I like seeing some characters who, and this is very common in Batman villains, but this is even like, this is that to like an extreme example, and it was delivered so brilliantly in this simple visual, right? In a way that you could have some expository dialogue. Oh, when he sees children lighting on fire, like, it would be awful if they tried to just deliver that with dialogue. But here, just like, boom, just in just a few frames, even, it's like we see it, and we see the world through his eyes, and we understand, like, this is someone who needs to not be out on the street with access to fire, right? Like, and that doesn't necessarily mean he needs to be like locked away in Arkham for his whole life, right? And that's where kind of our, concerns and thoughts about the justice system comes in, where it's like, well, what is an actual practical way to try to help someone like this lead a fulfilling life without lighting other humans on fire? Like, how do we do that? And I don't think there's a simple answer to that, but I think there are some very obvious bad answers. And I think most of what our world does and most of what Gotham does are those obvious bad answers. Here, he's deliberately let loose by Harvey Bullock and Flass in an attempt to draw out Batman, which, works, because Batman's like, oh, a building's on fire with kids in it, I'm going to head over there, right? This was part of their, hunting Batman program. And then they murder. I mean, Flass murders, right? Is it Flass who does it, right? It's not Bullock?
I think it's Bullock, but I'm not sure.
It's Bullock, yeah. Literally just murders Firebug. And he falls out a window and then is deemed a hero, for stopping the bad guy, who he literally put out on the street with access to his equipment. And yeah, I think the like Harvey and Flass, the Bullock and Flass, not to be confused with Harvey Dent, their dynamic I think is interesting. I think them being like so corrupt and like really evil, right? Like they don't seem to have very complex motives. And I think that really adds a lot to it, you know, showing these like very bad cops. I also think it's interesting that they have Flass as a black character here. And, you know, it adds to the whole, you know, this when we're talking about criminal justice and stuff, like in some places it really is like the whole thing is like a bunch of white people and policing, you know, black neighborhoods. And obviously that's bad and doesn't make any sense. But oftentimes there are, you know, there's a number of black folks in the you know, police system, in the department, and that doesn't always make things better, right? It's not like that automatic, like it's a better starting point, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the system is then going to be good and just and to deliver the results that like
there are women who uphold patriarchy, there are gay people who are really anti-trans, like, you know, all those kind of things. And there's a couple things I want to touch on there. One is I think you're right. It's actually this is holding up a mirror to another part of this whole justice system idea, which is, I think it's very tied to the vengeance. We hear about people doing terrible things. Like if you hear about someone who lights children on fire, like most of us, I think even those of us who have a very kind of like more nuanced idea of what criminal justice should be, my first response is like, that's a horrible person. And what I then have to fight is like, I want something horrible to happen to that person because they're lighting kids on fire. I think pedophilia, I'm not even going to go to that. Never mind. It's a similar metaphor, but I don't want to get.
No, I know.
You know, and I think a lot of times it's hard for us to reconcile this idea that a person can do so many horrible things. And then what do we do with that desire for vengeance, whether it's personal or just kind of societal? And with the Firefly character, we get this interesting idea of like, yeah, this person doesn't want to do harm. And a lot of the push for reform in our modern day police state system is this idea of like, how can we separate out the need to put people in a situation where they are unable to continue doing harm? How do we help to reform them if possible so that they will no longer do harm, and separate them out from they are bad, therefore they should suffer, so that our desire for vengeance feels better in some ways. And, you know, some will argue that the threat of punishment is a deterrent. I think we've seen pretty clearly statistically that's not the case, but, you know, that's another point of view and not to be argued here. But, yeah, the point being, I think all of it, and then putting it up against people like Quinzel, who we see kind of already as Harley, and I want to give her whole conversation in a few minutes, who I think is acting somewhat more. She may have some, you know, motivations that are more altruistic of doing good or trying to save people, but I think she also has a lot of her own personal motivations, and especially towards the end. And that, like, compare a cop like Bullock in this, who, as he said, is just like pure malevolence in many ways, with someone like the image of Montoya in The Dark Knight, who wants to be a good cop, wants to do well, but when put up against the desire, I think it's her mother is like going to be killed unless she helps the Joker, she does the corrupt thing, but for a very different motivation. Like I think you could look at her and Bullock and call them equally corrupt. And I think that in terms of the harm they do, that may actually be somewhat accurate, but their reasons for it, again, are fundamentally different, you know, just like the Firebug and Penguin.
Yeah. So you pivoted to Penguin there, which I think is a good, because you were talking about Quinzel for a minute. Right? But yeah, I mean, if we want to talk about Penguin, like
I think Penguin is the most like clearly malicious. Like she just wants to get rich and have power.
Yeah, she's just a mob boss, you know, who's like not doing it for family. You know, it's like she's just like, yeah, I want money. I'm somehow a master criminal, even though I'm going to bump off one of my own kids by just like a tip off from my enemy. That part didn't really work for me. I was like, wait, what? You're not going to try and fact check this? But like, I did appreciate, I didn't like the first episode that much. I think it's Minnie Driver as Penguin, by the way.
And just to be clear, for those of us who are hearing a she and a Minnie Driver, they do a number of interesting flips in the show, and one of them is they make Penguin a woman. Right. And we'll talk about that in a second, but go on.
Yeah, and it, she's just a mob boss. She's just like, I mean, Penguin usually, it's pretty much kind of what Penguin is a lot of the time, right? She's basically a fairly normal penguin. She just happens to be a woman. And what I like about that in particular is that Batman has a real tendency to take almost every female villain and have them be sympathetic, relatable, not like a real evil villain the way, Joker or maybe Riddler or a handful of other male villains. I mean, overall, Batman villains tend to be more relatable than a lot of other villains, right? Which we've been talking about. But like, that's especially true with female villains, especially true with attractive female villains. And you could say, well, this Penguin's kind of heavy, and like, so maybe they're not totally breaking that mold. But I did just feel like this Penguin basically let us say, like, look, there are some really nasty, malevolent people in the world who are just greedy and just want stuff. And we have to figure out what to do about that. And then and some of them are women, some of them are men. And then there's also, people who do villainous things that aren't motivated by greed or by malice. I mean, greed and malice are kind of two different things, right? There's like wanting someone else to suffer, and then there's just like wanting to have stuff for yourself, right? And those are the two things that we might call evil, right?
I would say Catwoman is a very interesting counterplay to this, because in this, Catwoman has no altruistic motives. She's purely greed. Yeah. But she's not really malicious. She's like, rich people have stuff. That sucks. I want stuff. I'll take stuff from rich people. Yeah. And she's not actively trying. And yes, I do think that she is much more attractive and flirts with Batman in a way that Penguin, who is both heavier set, although I have a comment on that because I think there is a heavy set character who is portrayed as very attractive in this, but also she's older and she has the nose of the Penguin idea. Yeah. And I think they didn't try to give Catwoman any kind of altruistic motive. They didn't try to give her a hero turn, as often happens. But she's also not. She's just a burglar.
Exactly.
People. She doesn't have some evil plan. She just wants stuff. And rich people have stuff.
Right, exactly. Yeah, so I feel like, I don't know, I almost think like if you took out like a, an alignment chart, like a D&D alignment chart, like you'd have characters who are really on like basically every point when you really think of it, and so I just really appreciate the, the diversity of villains in terms of, not just what they look like or whatever, but like the motivation, right? And I think it plays better when you have a villain like Firebug, when you also have a villain like Penguin, right? When you also have a burglar like Catwoman and then even someone like Carlo, what was his name? Basil Carlo. He was Clayface here, but where he's got, it's kind of more vanity and some vengeance and stuff like that going on, and there's all these different motivations. And I feel like the writers were very interested in the motivations of the characters. And so Batman was able to be interested in the motivations of the characters, right? If you don't have complex motive, then you can't really have a detective who's that interested in motive, because it's always simple, essentially.
Well, also, I think it's a part of what allows the Batman character to shift away from vengeance, is because vengeance is driven on this idea of these are bad people, they deserve to suffer. Right. And I've always thought that some of the most interesting stories are where, and I actually think the TV show Gotham did one of the best jobs of this, is that when a person does something bad to you, and this can be on like broad political scales or just like, the person in 8th grade who, stole your pencil or whatever, like, it's easy in your head to build them up to be a monster. And that's very much what young Bruce Wayne does with Joe Chill, and then gets this very disappointed feeling when it's just like, this is just a guy who like is killing people. Like, he's not good, like a upstanding, wonderful guy, but also as someone who's just as much a victim of like the poverty system and all this, and is driven to crimes of desperation much more than like, malicious, like, I want to rule the world crimes.
Yeah. And like killing him is not going to change anything. Like,
yeah, exactly.
Not going to bring my parents back, at least, right?
For sure. Let's talk about Harlequin Quinzel.
Harleen Quinzel?
Yeah. Let's talk about Harleen Quinzel. And I want to start just by saying, because I kind of mentioned her before, they changed her character in a number of ways. One of which is, until the very end of the show, it's not clear whether she is like already connected to Joker or not. And we'll get to that in a bit. But also, they make her, I think Asian is supposed to be her background. And they make her, I mentioned that I do think there's a character who is heavier set, but also quite attractive.
Sure, yeah.
She's definitely not portrayed as like model thin. She's presented as heavier, but when she puts on like the Harlequin outfit, in her case, it's form-fitting, and like she looks damn good in it. Like, I think thick would probably be a very appropriate description. And I liked that a lot in terms of her character. And I thought it really reflected, on the one hand, I want to say it reflects a, like, we don't have to portray all attractive people as the same. I don't want to give the show too much credit, because I think it just reflects like changing beauty standards in our world. Sure. That like, more hourglass figures are portrayed as a lot more attractive, particularly for women of color, and like all the, nonsense that gets into. But I just liked it as one more difference of her character, of like, because particularly when she is the psychiatrist, she's not presented as a sex pot. She's not pencil skirts and impossibly high heels and all this kind of stuff. And she's presented as, like, at first, I think you're very much supposed to think this is the person before she's met Joker in any way, who is just a psychiatrist who has sympathy for her patients. What we learn is that she's kidnapping and brainwashing her patients. And
right.
She might have some like, well, this is actually the best way to cure them, but curing them also means that they're all brainwashed and doing, like, she's kind of a sadistic dominatrix type in some ways.
Yeah.
Which I think is going to cause a lot of young people to ask a lot of questions that they'll be dealing with for the rest of their lives, and that's fine. But cat women have been doing that for generations. But also, just, I think, like, there's been this growing trend, and I think Margot Robbie has a lot to do with it, but other people as well, of like, can we not just make Harley an appendage to Joker, but give her a lot more independence? And normally that's, in kind of the Margot Robbie way, Joker makes her and then she breaks free.
Right.
This really portrayed a Harley completely free of Joker, who's just kind of awful and badass in her own way. What do you think of her portrayal in this?
Yeah, I thought it was super interesting. I enjoyed it a lot. First of all, we meet her as Bruce Wayne's psychiatrist, right? Court-appointed psychiatrist, because he does something angry, and then he's mandated to go to a certain number of appointments.
He does not willingly do this. It's a like court-ordered.
Yes, this is not Bruce Wayne being like, maybe I'll get some therapy.
Yeah, it does seem like Harley is the only psychiatrist in Gotham, because she apparently has a wide range of what kind of client she deals with, but we can put that aside for now.
Yes, and she's also like an expert witness in court cases, and yes, although it was Leslie Tompkins, right? Leslie Thompson was there, I think. Tompkins, it was Tompkins, yeah. But like, yeah, there's not a lot of other strengths there, but so we definitely see her in a very in her own professional environment. And then we see her being very, proactive in terms of dating and like just being her. Right.
Yeah.
And then we see that not like she's become Harley Quinn, but like she's been Harley Quinn for some time, because she's got this collection of former billionaires who she got most of whom to donate monies to charity and whatever, but also to like dress up as babies and whatnot and like do stuff for her. And it's definitely, it's one of these like, okay, I see what you're doing, but also I have some notes, like maybe you can brainwash them without having them dress up like babies if that's what they're into, cool, no problem, whatever, to each their own. But
I don't think this is the best illustration of active consent in kink world. I'll put it that way.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah.
The whole kidnapping aspect might be the first clue.
Right. Yeah, there's a lot of kidnapping going on. And so it does seem like she has a blend of altruism and I don't know if it's vengeance or sadism or exactly what, but like she's got a mix of stuff going on, which I like. I feel like it doesn't have to be one or the other, right?
I think especially it's particularly directed in a way that I think is a really important social commentary, because as a psychiatrist, it seems like her specific direction of anger is towards rich men, but especially rich men who are unable or unwilling to open up about their feelings. And it's often, and I think she's very critical of Bruce Wayne in that, at the end of their quartered sessions, Bruce is like, "Oh, I got a lot out of this." And she's like, "No, you didn't. You didn't open up at all."
Right.
And you kind of get the sense that she kind of wants to kidnap Bruce and add him to her collection, but doesn't.
Right.
And we see at least a couple of other cases. We see one specific case where she does add someone to her collection, and it's exactly that. It's someone who is another man who won't open up about his feelings.
Yeah.
And again, I think adding to the richness of it, you talked about her dating life. We only see her go on one date, so I think that it is very open what kind of queerness she is. But she very clearly is queer. It's a date with Montoya, and is presented in a really kind of awesome, very cutesy way, where she's super nervous and she's asking Barbara to help in a kind of middle school pass a note way, because everyone does, but especially if you spend any time in sapphic circles, they'll often talk about women having no idea how to flirt with other women, and that was really well represented here.
Yeah.
So I just think and when I say all of that is because I think the idea of the man-hating lesbian who loves other women and likes torturing men is a cliche that I think you can have some fun with it, but also can become pretty queer-phobic. That's not what is shown here. Yeah. I think it could go in that direction for sure, but they don't sort of dabble in that part of it. She has romantic interest in a woman. She's torturing these men for her own benefit, but it doesn't take on that element, which I really appreciated.
Yeah, for sure. I really appreciated that her relationship with Montoya was just presented very matter-of-factly. Yeah. In the way that I feel it should be, and that if we get another 10 or 20 years of stories doing that in a non-sensational way, maybe we'll live in a world where commenting on that fact doesn't feel necessary anymore.
Well, and I think that's important. And this is maybe we're almost an hour. So it's a 10 episode show, and often we can do a whole hour on an episode. So we're probably gonna have to do a part 2 of this some other time. But I'll just say one of the things I think the show does is set in a time that's probably somewhere in the 30s to 50s in terms of technology. There's no computers, there's no cell phones, there's dial-up phones, all this kind of stuff. But it also, a lot of times when people are making sort of period pieces like this, particularly when it's white folks making them, it's sort of we get to have people use the N-word all the time. And we get to have people be horribly racist and sexist because those were the times. And I think there's been a growing direction. I think there's been a movement opposite that, which I feel like this is very much a part of yes, it's the 1930s, but 2 women can kiss at a restaurant and have no problems. And a black man can be commissioner of police. And even today, as you said, there's going to be some racism around that. And the show doesn't shy from that. But in the 1930s, that would be almost impossible for a large city like this to have, a black man in that kind of a position, let alone also, some of the other positions they have. And I think I think we can do a whole. I'm going to say both of the I keep mixing up Arthur Dent and Harvey Dent. Time Traveler's Guide to the Galaxy and all that. Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Thank you. We're going to save the Harvey Dent storyline and the idea of what time period should Batman be saved in for part 2 that we'll record some other time. But I do think I like that idea of it being kind of timeless. It is the technology of this time, but much more the social mores of today or even the future that we want.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's a reminder that like Gotham is Gotham. Gotham's not New York. Gotham's
Yep.
not DC. Gotham's not Detroit. It's Gotham. And this isn't this isn't the same world that even other Batman stories take place in, right?
Yeah.
It's certainly not the world we live in right now. And so there's no reason that you can't have the technology that existed in the 1930s or 40s or 50s or even 20s, right?
Mhm.
In our world, in a world that just doesn't have these same issues, these same things going on that we have here. And even if it does, they don't necessarily have to be centered, right? It's
Yeah.
like, and I think there's something to be said for literal historical stories that show certain level of historical accuracy.
Yeah.
But there's no reason that you can't tell stories in what looks like the same time period, but with some important differences that are like, well, they still have corruption. They've still got a lot of bad stuff, but they don't have the same racism, sexism, and homophobia to the same extent, at least that we have now, and certainly had, you know, in the 30s and
Right.
40s and such.
Like in a lot of ways, I think I would positively compare this to Game of Thrones,
Okay,
where,
yeah,
because I think Westeros and
yeah,
Gotham exist in very similar ways.
yeah,
And if your first response is to go, wait, but Westeros is fantasy, like the supernatural is literally introduced in terms of like an actual ghost in this show.
yes, yes.
Um,
This is fantasy,
yeah, and I think in
which I
both
loved, by the
cases,
way, the way that all played out. But
yeah, in both
we can,
cases, I think this is a model. Like it is modeled on a particular time period. Like Gotham is very much like similar to a 1930s, 1920s, whatever, New York or Chicago.
yeah,
In the same way that Westeros is kind of a Middle Ages, England or Europe or something like that.
yeah,
But where this show, as we said, is kind of saying, okay, and there were a lot of terrible things at that time period. We don't have to show them. I think the writer, but even more the writer of the books, but even more the makers of the TV show were like, oh, wait a minute, there was a lot of sexual violence and bad treatment of women in that world. What if we
right,
do that all the time
all the
and do it in
time.
ways where like actually a lot of like tits are going to be shown while
Right.
like being but this sexual violence, it's bad, but isn't it fun to watch? Like, and it got a lot
Oh,
of critique.
HBO.
I think it got a lot of critique, very legitimately so. HBO, they would go on to like every mob show, some mobster has to own a strip club, and we
Right.
have to
Yeah. Yeah.
have many scenes happen in that strip
Yeah.
club.
I mean, like The Wire is like arguably the greatest show ever, but it definitely there are
Yeah,
times when it's like, okay, how are we gonna get some more tits on this screen? Like
right.
it really, you can hear the writers like that's like almost like one of the biggest complaints. So like, and it's not a
Yeah,
lot of complaints, but it's just like this is clearly what this scene is for.
I mean, literally in season one, they own a strip club
Yeah.
and have many of their meetings at the strip club, and the
Yeah.
camera always is like, oh, but who's on stage right now? Don't you want to know?
Right.
That's
Like
essential. Um, and like in Sopranos, they own a strip club. And I think it's become a
right.
fairly common thing. But
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah. So I just really like that about this. The kind of like it's the aesthetics of a specific time and period. And I think this is what we'll talk about more in next episode. But
Sure.
it raises really interesting questions of like to what extent is Batman tied to a specific like both time in terms of like our understanding of wealth and understanding of the police, but also just an aesthetic that doesn't really connect to the world of cell phones and TikTok and cyber and everything.
Yeah. Absolutely. We're going to talk more about that later, right? I don't go on
Exactly.
a like 20 paragraph rant. Cool.
Yeah. So what are a couple other little things you wanted to bring up?
Okay, a very little thing. And this fits the kind of 30s, 40s theme also. There's Clayface is a character. His name is Basil Carlo, right? And there's a scene where he and Batman are dueling with swords. And they're going up a staircase and you see their shadows behind them, like dueling, right? And this is like a shot exactly from, I think it was called The Adventures of Robin Hood. Anyway, the Robin Hood movie with Errol Flynn and Basil Rathbone. And Basil Rathbone was,
I love that.
Yes. So Basil Rathbone was this brilliant actor who was very beloved, but also didn't really get to play the leading man that much. He played Sherlock Holmes, but like, which also then I feel like ties in with Batman as well, but it.
By the way, I want to make a small note on that because if you watch earlier versions of Batman or read earlier versions of Batman, and are like, why is but the original writers never mentioned Sherlock Holmes? Why is it that all of a sudden they do? It's because the copyright ran out. Like it's not, and the original like Kane and I forget their names, but the original writers of Batman have said that they were like in part influenced by Sherlock Holmes. They just couldn't mention it because
they couldn't. Yeah, that makes sense. I actually knew someone who did something with the estate of Arthur Conan Doyle and whatever. Anyway, a literary agent. So, but like, yeah, so there's this like this really kind of nice little Easter egg, like if you're into like 30s movies or 40s movies or something, you know?
Yeah.
And so I just really enjoyed that. And I'm sure there were other things like that probably that maybe I didn't pick up on. We'll talk more about Harvey Dent next time, right? But I liked this Harvey Dent story. There's certain things about it that I thought were really cool. And I feel like when you see The Dark Knight and then you see this Harvey Dent story, there's a nice kind of, you know, two sides of the coin, which for Two-Face, for Harvey Dent, I think plays really well. So I enjoyed that. I enjoyed the gentleman ghost thing where it's like, Batman's like, well, obviously he's not a ghost. And then the ghost shows up. He's like, oh, obviously this is a ghost. I need to change my worldview, you know, which that's something that like gets back to like, this will be my closing thing where like, that gets back to what I love about Batman, that Batman has a very clear view of the world, has certain assumptions about what's going on. But when something comes and challenges those assumptions, the first thought is like, okay, how can this be true given my assumptions? And then when the conclusion is like, it can't be, then it's like, okay, then I need to adjust, right? I need to change my worldview.
When you've limited the impossible, whatever resists, no matter how improbable, must be true.
And exactly.
And yet, I love that so much because it's funny. I just made a TikTok about this in terms of politics, but to me, that's one of the highest ideas of intelligence. Well, it sounds very elitist in terms of like high, but like I think that is, to me, it is a sign of the kind of mind that is needed to exist in this world. And I think so many problems like don't have that. You know, For example, the mindset of a lot of the police: if you're a criminal, you are a bad person. Gordon sees evidence about Batman that makes him change his worldview. Bullock sees that evidence but refuses to accept it. And I think in our own world, that is something that is one of the causes of so many problems, is people who have a worldview and are unwilling to listen to evidence that would actually cause them to be like, oh, maybe what I was taught in like 5th grade biology 40 years ago about gender doesn't actually still apply. You know, maybe my understanding of how economics works isn't actually how it works. You know, like we just don't have that from so many people in this world.
Yeah. And I think you asked about cognitive dissonance in the poker podcast we did, or the episode about poker. And I think that's more what cognitive dissonance really is. It's that having a worldview and then getting information that contradicts that, and having that information like in your sphere, but not accepting it, and having this dissonance between what you believe or want to believe and then stuff that is in your zone, and like you can't, there's dissonance there, right? There's not harmony.
Yeah. What else was on your bullet list?
Actually, that was maybe most of it. Yeah, I mean, there's like getting deeper into the Harvey Dent story, but like mostly that was about kind of, I think I like this one better than The Dark Knight, because the whole thing with like him and Barbara, I think is much more interesting than like Rachel getting fridged. Like The Dark Knight's an absolutely brilliant movie, but like, you know, there's some spots, right? I mean, we've covered it sometimes, and like there's some things where it's like, well, that doesn't make it a bad movie. But it's like, what if you told a story where the dude's motivation wasn't that a woman got killed, you know?
Yeah.
What if you told a different story than that? And Yeah.
We'll talk about that because I don't think that's his whole motivation, but I think that is the thing that causes his worldview to crack.
Oh,
And
yeah. That's fair. That's fair. 100%. 100%.
But yeah,
I don't mean to sell it so simply. I just mean like you had one female character. You know what I mean? Of consequence.
Totally agree.
Yeah,
I think The Dark Knight is an incredible movie that's also somewhat of its time and has some problems in that regard.
Right.
And yeah, we'll talk a lot more about Dent because I realized I think I want to watch it again because, and maybe this is just how powerful the Dent story is. I felt kind of burnt out. Like the last whole 3 episodes are about Harvey Dent and him becoming. I don't know if he becomes Two-Face, and that's kind of what we'll discuss, but something like that. Certainly he has his face burnt off and he goes on, this criminal spree. And I was just like, there's so many other characters. Do we have to do this character yet again? Because we've done it in The Dark Knight. And I was kind of like, wait, is The Dark Knight just that big in my subconscious that this movie from like 20 years ago seems like it was just done yesterday? But anyway, we'll discuss that later. There's one other question that I want to ask that we're going to dive into in our members section, which is what does the very last revelation about what I think is Joker, how does that affect how we see Harley Quinn? And if you want to listen to that, all you have to do is become a member. It's $5 a month, $55 a year. You get the bonus content at the end of almost all of our episodes. You get free episodes that are just, you get exclusive episodes that are just for members. We've been doing them in Star Wars. Starting in the fall, we're going to be doing them in superhero ethics. All this kind of great stuff. And of course, you can help support the podcast. All the information is on our show notes. One thing I'm also going to say is that this podcast is going to go into somewhat of a hiatus. We have one more episode coming out that I'm going to be recording with Riki about Genesis Neon Evangelion, the anime, and just some ideas of anime and crime fighting and all this kind of stuff in general, or fighting for justice in general. And then we're going to take most of September off as a hiatus. I need the time because I'm doing a lot of personal travel, but also because I want to take some time and actually like back up and rethink how we're doing things. I'm not getting your feedback as fast as I want to. We're not doing enough to promote the podcast. So we're going to spend September really focusing on those things and then hit the ground running. There will still be episodes, and we're going back and finding some of the best of our older episodes and re-putting them up in the feed and things like that, as well as getting access to some of other podcasts and things like that I think are really worth checking out. So please stick around. We're going to have, that's be in September, but then new episodes coming in the fall for sure. So please become a member if you want to listen to more of that conversation. But if not, thank you all so much. On behalf of Paul and myself, we have spoken. All right, welcome back. So this first season is very notably absent of a Joker character, which I really liked. I think it's kind of a fake out at one point of a kind of, you hear this kind of maniacal laugh by a redheaded guy and then realize he's just someone being tortured by Harley. But then at the very end, we see kind of this like references to some of the other plots that have happened and hear a guy having a kind of, maniacal laugh over it. And the implication that maybe all the little things we've seen is part of some larger plan. So first of all, let me just ask, do you agree that I think the implication is supposed to be that that's going to be our Joker character?
Yes. I think that's the implication, is that that's the Joker. I totally missed the references to earlier events somehow. I think the only thing I recall is just him basically using Joker toxin on some people and being like, yes, perfect. Like, now I've got it. And that's about all I got out of that scene. Maybe I guess I missed.
No, I don't think it goes much deeper than that.
Oh,
I think we sort of saw a flash or two, but I may be wrong.
I'm certainly not saying you are, but I just didn't catch any of that. I just definitely was like, oh yeah, there's the Joker. It's like the end of Batman Begins where, Gordon's like, he left this card and it's like a Joker card,
Right.
Where it's basically like season 2, the Joker. And I do feel like if you're going to tell a Batman story that's more than a season or two or more than a movie or two, like, you should probably have a Joker because he's a really pivotal Batman character. But I did really appreciate having a full season of 10 episodes with a strong number of different antagonists and non-antagonists kind of, I guess a lot of them were antagonists, even if they were like Like Gordon was an antagonist, right? So
Yeah.
was Gordon for a minute. So was
I think
Montoya.
Bullock is a straight up villain.
Yeah, of course, right? But so there were a lot of characters who Batman did battle with essentially, and none of them were the Joker, and I enjoyed that. I thought that was cool. That was like we even got like 4 Robins, I think, but I do feel like, yeah, at some point give me a Joker, like let me see what you got. And similarly, like Batman Begins, I think it was a good choice not to start with the Joker, because the previous Batman series had, and
he takes up so much of the oxygen in the room.
Yeah.
That I think kind of giving a chance to learn more about the world and then put the Joker into that world.
Right. And there's like, how are you going to follow that act? Kind of,
right.
Like you can, but The Dark Knight Rises wasn't quite as well received as The Dark Knight. There's stuff, but.
Well, and so here I think is the larger question then, how does his appearance, and maybe the answer is not at all, change how you felt about what they did with the Harley character? Because what I thought they were doing was very much showing us that in this version, Harley Quinn has a villain. We don't know what her villain origin story is,
right.
but that it exists long before the Joker comes along. And then I wondered at the end if they were trying to tell us that no, that's not the case. And we don't know, it's pure speculation, but I think did seeing Joker in that way change anything for you about who Harley is or Harley's story?
Not really. I mean, basically the only update I received there was like Joker exists in this world, right? This is a world with Joker. And the whole like Harley Quinn not being, a Joker spinoff essentially.
Mm-hmm.
Like I don't want the only Harley Quinn to be this Harley Quinn who didn't have anything to do with the Joker. Like I feel like, I mean, she was literally created as a henchwoman, right? And then became a really big deal. So like that is her origin story as a character, right?
Right.
And I don't think there shouldn't be characters like that. Like I don't think that version of the character should be erased. But I think this version of the character is a great addition to the, here's another way that Harley could exist, right? She could become her own. She could become Harley Quinn on her own, of her own volition. We don't really know what happened. We don't actually get her backstory. I would be disappointed if the backstory turned out that like she was a psychiatrist and then she met the Joker and then maybe he wasn't a big deal yet, but then he turned her into Harley Quinn, and I would hate that. Like that would be very disappointing, right? From this though, I don't get any lean one way or another. I'm just like, okay, Joker's around. I think it'll be really interesting if we see Joker in season 2 and not much Harley. And then like maybe in a season 3 or later in season 2, Harley shows up again. And then we kind of see like, okay, what's it like to have Joker and Harley running around in a world where Joker didn't make Harleen Quinzel into Harley Quinn. Right.
Although I think important to note here, especially those who haven't seen it, is that Harley has basically been revealed and she's now on the run.
Right.
And so the chance of like still having the idea of Joker's arrested, put in Arkham, and she's his therapist.
Yeah.
You really have to stretch to make that happen. And I think there's ways you could do it. It could be that she comes back and like you change her identity. Or like, that no
she was presumed dead also, right?
Yes, I believe that's the case. Yeah. And I don't think I don't think Barbara put it on like the front page of, oh, by the way, this person was horrible and terrible.
Yeah.
So there's ways to do it. But yeah, I mean, I agree with you that I think that character shouldn't be erased, but I also like new versions of it, especially because I do have some problems with that version of the story, especially when it's very romanticized, because there is people can be very manipulative of other people in all sorts of dynamics, and often that is men manipulating women, but that's by no means the only direction it can go. And there's some truth, to be sure, to like a man manipulating a woman into becoming his sidekick, his assistant in lives of crime and stuff like that. But especially when you put it in the power dynamic of a therapist and a criminal, it's always been a story that's like a little bit of making me roll my eyes. Like I think it's possible, but I think there can be a lot of misogyny in how the story is told. Not that it's always done that way by any means. but particularly once she's a lot more kind of sexualized and stuff like that. And that's why I like Margot Robbie changing it. I think having her be completely independent and completely different could be it. How would you feel, though, if what we learned is that, she's been kidnapping these men, brainwashing them, and, psychologically changing them quite dramatically. And that one of the people she tried that on didn't necessarily become like what she wanted, but just kind of mentally broke and escaped, or somehow whatever, and that became the Joker. And so whether intentionally or not intentionally, we're fully reversing it to Harley has now played a role in creating the Joker.
I think that would be an interesting alternative, an interesting story. I definitely wouldn't want that to become like the new main Joker story. For me, the best Joker story, like the main Joker story, is always going to be like, we don't know Joker's backstory.
Yeah.
For me, that's always the main thing, is Joker maybe doesn't even know Joker's backstory, right?
Yeah.
That was one thing I really loved in The Dark Knight, is that he just kept telling different versions, of what happened, of how he became the Joker. And, there are ones where we see his origin, and I don't have a problem with that, the same way I wouldn't have a problem with flipping the origin story, right? And also I think in the original Harley Quinn backstory, Mad Love, I think she has a lot of agency in that, right? Like, she actually, like, yes, she's manipulated, but like also she falls in love with him, which, like, the extent to which that's just manipulation or just like her, I think I'm not sure. I mean, I've read the comic and watched the show of that.
Right.
But it's been some time. But so I think that's a little different. Like, in my mind, I'm seeing like Suicide Squad, right? I'm seeing the Suicide Squad version.
Right.
But then I'm like, wait, but I think the one before that was a little different. I think they like took away more of her agency in the Suicide Squad,
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think it's important to note that when she's first created by Paul Dini as a character in Batman the Animated Series, we don't get her origin story. I think Mad Love was even what was it an episode of?
Of Batman the Animated Series.
Okay,
or
so
Batman,
that does come along
whatever
eventually,
the later part. Yeah, but it's like way at the end. It's when she's introduced, she's just there, basically. There's no explanation. It's just like, oh, what if, one of the Joker's henchmen was a woman, and she was dressed like a Harlequin, basically, right? So, and this speaks to the nature of comics and the nature of adaptations where you have many iterations, right? And they're not all taking place in the same world. And there's not one true timeline and then maybe like a Legends canon. Like, because we do have 2 Luke Skywalkers, right? At least like there was the legend. Those are in novels. But in terms of like the on-screen, you've got the Disney versions. And
Legends, I would say, gives us at least 3 or 4 different versions of Luke. But yeah, they're all
fair enough.
They're all they're all in the same realm. That the Last Jedi is fairly different from all of them.
Right. And so, but with comics and then comic book adaptations, you'll get a lot of different versions in the comics. And then sometimes there's some multiverse stuff where it's like, no, but they all really, it's okay. Yeah. But like, you get, I mean, I've seen a lot more Harley Quinns in animation as like part of Suicide Squad, as like different, not that live action movie, but like a whole bunch of Suicide Squad movies. And they're all kind of a little bit different, and sometimes Joker's involved and sometimes I think he's not. And I appreciate there being like these different stories, the same way we have different Batmans. Like, here's a different Harley Quinn, and maybe this becomes the main one going forward. Maybe it doesn't. I don't
We're
feel
about
strongly.
to get a new one with the Lady Gaga, building on the Joker movie that came out a couple years ago.
Right, the Arthur Fleck Joker or whatever.
Yep.
Yeah, I did. Yeah.
I hated that original movie. I stopped it halfway through, but I'm curious to see what the Lady Gaga take on this is all going to be.
Yeah, and like I thought it was brilliant and transfixing, and like I don't even really know or care exactly what it had to say or whatever, but like
Mhm.
I thought it, like, just in terms of performance, it was amazing, but like that's not like my Joker. That's
Yeah.
just a movie that's called Joker, you know, and it's its own idea.
Yeah.
And
I guess
so
fair.
I think the fact that we get different versions, and it's like it doesn't have to be like, no, this is the one.
Yeah.
Um, and
Well,
if you flip that, you know, her and Joker's relationship and literally invert it, I think
mhm.
that's interesting. You know, it's something to play
Yeah.
with. Basically, it's a different story.
Well, especially because I think this is the issue we're going to go much more into when we do a part 2 of this, which will not be like next week. We're going to wait a little while on that. Like one of the things that I want to talk about in terms of like what time period should the Batman story be set is that the social mores of us, the audience, and also of the people writing it have changed so dramatically
Mm.
from the 1930s when this character was first created. In everything from, you know, how critical, like the 1930s was a time when the police were often viewed very critically. And in the 1940s and 50s, like that became literally illegal because of
Mm.
like some of the restrictions on comic books and much more patriotic and cops are great.
Right.
You know, all the way to, you know, the age we're in now, the view of wealthy, like I think in many ways one of the hardest challenges for writing Batman today is that our perspective of wealthy people, for many of us, not all of us, has changed so dramatically in the last 10, 15 years, but also in the last like 30 years, or, you know, and it changed a lot from the 30s to the 50s, to the 80s, etc. So yeah, and I think the way that we portray relationships of women and men has changed a lot. And I think the Joker Harley story, in part, is one of the hardest to tell because I do think that, you know, I think there have been very important. There are times when there's a particular story that becomes a cliche and a stereotype, and often a harmful one.
Mm.
And to the point where any attempt to retell that story has to be done with so much context of other characters and stuff like that, or else it feels like, you know, you're just replicating the stereotype. You know, the only black character is a drug dealer is not a great look by any means. But then when, like, you know, if that means you can't ever write a black character as a drug dealer, or, you know, like a gay person, like
Yeah.
a world in which every lesbian has to be wonderful and that you can't, or any queer woman, and so you can't have Harley be who she is, like that's not great either.
Right.
My point being that I think the Harley Joker story in particular has become such a focal point of discussions about male-female relationships and the Me Too movement and, you know, gaslighting and so much. And I think there have been some versions of it that have been very problematic and have played into very problematic dynamics that are often about patriarchy and misogyny and things like that. But I do think it suffers a little bit when it's like you can't tell a story between Harley and Joker that has any romance at ever because, you know, you're replicating these things. And so I'm really curious what Joker and Harley will do because I think kind of what you were saying about the definitive story, when Margot Robbie has changed the character of Harley a lot and allowed her to go on this new direction, there's a lot of media attention saying, okay, this is now the new definitive Harley. And I'll be very curious how this new version of this character is responded to, but also how the Lady Gaga one is responded to. And is that seen as, oh, it's just going back to the old, or is it a new take on the romance, but one that isn't falling into some of the pitfalls of the earlier ones?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I think so. Obviously, live action gets way broader media attention than animated, right? I think animated, you're going to get people discussing in social media circles, and occasionally you'll have an animated film like, you know, Spider-Verse that will really get a lot of discussion. But I would also say that I think a lot of this discussion is maybe a little more niche than you might think it is in some ways.
Mm-hmm.
You know, just in terms of like, you know, there's a lot of different bubbles that different people are in, and I think there's a vast world of people who don't think about any of these things when watching media, right? And basically are just like, yeah, either I liked it or I didn't, you know?
Yeah.
And so I think it's entirely fair to say like, well, this story is looked at this way and this story is looked at this way, but also with the understanding it's like, well, within what circle kind of,
right.
And that.
Yeah, and I think that's multi-layered. I think I think you're right. There's lots of people who have they're not thinking about like feminism and relationships and any of this stuff when they're watching movies. I think that I think there's a large number of people who are much more connected to feminist circles or Me Too circles or like things like that, which I think is a significantly larger part of the population than the people who describe themselves as Batman fans, for whom the term a Joker and Harley relationship as an example of male manipulation became kind of a thing.
Okay.
And for whom like the Bird of Prey movie was seen as this very powerful, like, and I think rightly so, kind of like movement beyond that. And I guess that's what I'm talking about. You're right. Even that as like a social movement that goes, and I think lots and lots of those people probably have no idea that the show exists, or even that the Harley Quinn show on HBO does exist, which I think also is a whole other version of Harley that we haven't talked about much, but I think very much flows out of the Margot Robbie idea. But yeah, I also agree with you that like there's large parts of the population that have no idea even of that conversation.
Yeah, that makes sense. And also, I mean, I think the Margot Robbie idea of the character, I think, is in comics, right? Before the movies, right? Like there's a whole kind of like Harley on her own thing. Like that's
yes, definitely.
That was a thing already, right? And so it's not like she just like made up the new version of the character, but she like wanted it to go more in that direction.
I think there's two things. I think she wanted to bring it more into live action because, as you said, like I think the number of people who have seen the animated, the number of people who've seen read the comic books is the smallest, and then like the people who see the animated shows, and then the people who see the live action movies.
Right.
That's not always exact, but I think that's generally
something
true.
Like that. Yeah.
My understanding is that a lot of the comics were about Harley on her own, but didn't have the Harley breaking away from Joker, and in doing so, naming all of the harmful aspects of her relationship with Joker. I think that was more specific to the Margot Robbie, the Birds of Prey movie, and then now the Harley Quinn TV show. But I could very well be wrong on that. And comic readers, if I am, please let me know.
Okay, yeah.
So, all right. Well, I think this is a good place to wrap up. So, Paul, thank you again as always. To our members, thank you. It really makes all this possible. We have spoken.